Good morning, thanks for having me. So I am Matt. I helped found and build a company called Higher Ground Education, which is a network of Montessori schools and Montessori resources and trainings for parents, for teachers. And the goal of the network is like high growth Montessori. Let's not just have, some mom and pop Montessori schools here and there. Let's not just have this be a kind of underground organically growing thing. Let's grow it inorganically at startup speed. And we have about 130 schools across the world, including mostly in the US, but here, a couple in Paris, Spain, 8 in China, and elsewhere. So that's a little bit about me and us. And we're running, I don't know how many of you have children here, but we are running childcare and camps right now, if you're interested. Today I'm going to talk about education more generally, less about what we're doing specifically and more just about the state of the art, what are the trends, and how does that relate to projects like this as I understand them, things like charter cities, startup cities. And I think that the most kind of salient meta-level trend in education is that like many things and many institutions, it is fragmenting. It is fragmenting, and this is most evident in the US. This talk might be a little bit US-centric, but I think it'll have relevance to everywhere. It's fragmenting. The growth of homeschooling in the US has skyrocketed. When I was a child back in the dark ages in the 80s and 90s, homeschooling was a weird niche thing that a couple 100,000 people across the entire country did, mostly for religious reasons. And you can see over the last 20 years how much it's spiked, it's grown. 10x, 20x, somewhere in that range. The numbers have continued they plateaued and then went up a little bit after 21 into 22 and 23. You can find all sorts of different charts and analyses of this phenomenon. It's still a small portion of children in the US. There's 50, 60 million children enrolled in K-12 schools in the US, but it's like 10%, closer to 10%, not like 1% or less. So why is this? Why is that happening? There's micro schools, there's a rise of alternative education schools, most private schools are kind of downstream of public schools. They're like public schools, but a little bit better. They're pretty traditional. But there's just this meteoric rise over the last 20 years in real alternative education, some of which is very disconnected from traditional systems and support systems. And there's a bunch of different tailwinds that have contributed to this. A big one is technology. Technology, the internet, insofar as content access to knowledge was ever a limiter, that obstacle has been completely obliterated. In the last year, really, we've seen a lot of excitement about AI. Excitement about AI in education goes back to the 80s, to Bloom's Two Sigma problem paper, where Benjamin Bloom was this researcher who looked at tutoring in education and thought tutoring was the one and only intervention in education that really works. One-on-one attention, a lot of explicit direct instruction, hyper-personalized to the student, but of course it doesn't scale. And so he immediately started thinking about software. Is there like a way that you can create a guided path that's more personalized and more customized that scales with software? And he had artificial intelligence in mind, but in 1980, it wasn't feasible. And you are starting to see that now. There's a lot of people working on AI in education. I talked to a fair number of high school students who use AI as a tutor, totally unsupported by their schools. Their schools are either agnostic about it or skeptical of it or ban it, but they're like, yeah, I had to take BC calculus and I couldn't remember all the rules, the power rule and the chain rule and whatnot, so I just had an AI tutor. I gave it my context, I had it spin me up some problem sets, I asked it questions and I got caught up. And that kind of thing is very common, and it's good at that. I, as an experiment, went through an astrophysics textbook. It's just not a subject that I know anything about, and I was pretty shocked at how good it was as a tutor. But that's more forward-looking. I don't think AI has had a huge impact on education yet. The internet has, in a number of, by reducing friction to get content, and also by making it easier to find people who are doing different things, by doing community building. People really underestimate how much the internet impacts that. That's going to continue. I think in the near future, very near future, like, 3 to 5 years, maybe 10 years max, you're going to see a lot of schools that are in the format of The Montessori guide is the teacher, knows all the students, but the actual instruction and work is given by customized tutors that are largely AI. And for the student who loves engineering and math, you get the von Neumann tutor, and for the student that hates math, you get the drill sergeant tutor. And I mean, you're going to see a lot of customization and personalization along these lines that delivers even more kind of effective tutoring than you would see in kind of aristocratic tutoring settings. But I don't think that that's the primary driver. There are other drivers too. COVID was a huge kickstart. Of course, it just gave a lot of visibility into how bad the education system is. It kind of threw it in everybody's face. But I think if you zoom out a little bit and you ask parents, what is driving this trend? It's not they want more tutors. It's not even that they want more effective academics. It's not that they want niche things like very intense religious instruction. It's that the parents are more concerned about moral education and values in education. And they don't necessarily put it like that. Sometimes they do. If you just straight ask them, this is a Washington Post poll that came out a little while ago. They asked parents, most of whom were not religious, do you prefer to teach this child at home so that you can provide moral instruction rather than the school providing moral instruction? 68% of them said yes, and most of them are not interested in doing it for religious reasons. These kinds of character questions, behavior questions, mindset questions, things that get into what are your values? What kind of person are we making? Not the technocratic issues of or the technical issues of how much math are you learning? What job are you being set up with? What skills are you getting? What's your peer group like? How is it setting you up for life? Not these kinds of tiger mom questions, but the really deep questions about what kind of person do you want to raise? These are at the forefront of a huge portion of parents who are opting out of the system. People are skeptical of the system's ability to provide the default moral education or instruction. And that, I think, that's really core to understanding fragmentation in education. If you zoom way out and look at 2,600 years of education in a nutshell, going back to kind of post-Phoenician alphabet ancient Greece, where education emerged in the West. You first started to see something like schools in about 600 BCE. The records are fuzzy, but we know that there were schools in 600 BCE. Education for about 2,600 years, 2,560 years, was fundamentally about values. It was about what kind of person is a good citizen? What kind of person has a good soul? What kind of person is going to be great and successful and happy? Or post-Greeks, post-Hellenistic period, what kind of person is pious? What kind of person is going to heaven? So what the values are change over the course of Western civilization, and what the core works are that you read to instill those values changes, but it's an overriding concern. People want children who grow up to be good, and the problem of good people who have children who turn out to be rotten is very salient in this period. Like clearly happens, it's not just that goodness is inherited from parent to child, so it must have something to do with how they're raised with education, and people are overwhelmingly concerned with this problem. I'm just going to complicate this a little bit. Until about 1900, education was about values, and it was imparted through a language arts education. You got it through history, through a literary canon, through constant language arts instruction, even through the literacy instruction. You were constantly given lessons and moral lessons all the time, and that was a key part of how it worked. In the early 20th century, that started to change as, what we would today call STEM fields started to displace literary fields as vocational options, as status symbols. And so education was still about values during this time in certain ways, but it was starting to fade and become more technical. It was also starting to become more bureaucratic by this time and more Tayloristic. And in 1970, by 1970 at the latest, you start to see for the first time in Western history, skepticism that education is about values. Schools shouldn't teach values. Schools should teach you how to read and write. You don't want the state coming in and telling your child what's good and bad and what to think. That's the realm of the parent. And this has come up again and again in US politics. Every time the schools are a nexus for the culture wars, one of the moves is to say, why are schools even talking about this? This should be left in the home. Education is really about teaching these very specific academic things that teachers are qualified to teach, supposedly, and that parents are bad at teaching. And what you see now, and I think what drove the homeschooling movement back in the 70s, which was like a horseshoe movement of like people on the far left and people on the far right, they wanted to opt out of this bureaucratic Tayloristic system, and they went to live on homesteads and did homeschooling, and it was really radical then. Then till the present, a lot of what's driving that fragmentation is a growing recognition that education is about values. There's no dodging that question. And if you want a child who's like a builder and more entrepreneurial in his or her soul, not just like casually like they go to a makerspace camp, but 9 to 5 for like 18 years, they're filling out worksheets and doing what a teacher says. Like if you really want a different education that raises your children on different values or religious values or whatever it is, you have to really change the schooling model. And that is, I think, that's very real, and that's true now. And that's always been true in stable societies and also in less stable societies. So America is an experiment, was an experiment. America's a little bit more stable now. America is an experiment, it's a social experiment. And until about 1830 to 1850, really taking off in 1850, America did not have schools. Did not have schools. It was a homeschooling culture. Every house, every little township had a homeschool or a house where like 3 other neighborhood children went, sometimes under extreme, the history here is crazy. Like people in early America and colonial America were very impoverished, way more impoverished than anyone in the US is today or anyone on this island is today. And they still managed to pull together. There was a culture of caring about education and your children's education, their moral education and their literary education in a way that is unimaginable today. I think, really, like you'd have to go 3 generations forward or backward before you could even approximate how much people, like the ministers were preaching to the mothers and fathers about how important it is to educate your children. People were spending every spare moment of their time on this. They were subsistence farming and educating their children. Those were the 2 things that they were doing. And part of the reason is that, I think I've got a blank slide. Yeah, part of the reason is that America was new and in a sense fragmented and decentralized. There were a lot of different people with a lot of different ethoses coming to America, and there was a question as to what would hold it together. What would hold it together across generations? What would hold it together as the community shifted and changed? And the universal answer to that question was values and education. We need to have common heroes. We need to stick with similar texts. We need to have an approach that teaches our children to be thoughtful. But all of it is guided by this conviction that there's something about this place, about America, that is distinct, that we need to educate our children on so that they appreciate it. Children in early America, every single child in early America heard the story of George Washington's childhood until they were sick in the head of it, and that's where a lot of the myths of George Washington came from. A lot of it's not true, but it kind of got cemented in popular culture through the widespread sale of literature and widespread use of curricular materials that adopted kind of mythic versions of American founders that were designed to impart certain values. I think that that's interesting to think about for something like a startup city, something like an institution that's trying to surf a pattern of fragmentation and find new ways of connecting and find common values. I think that startup cities are social experiments that do embody values. I found this on the website for this conference. We empower the philosophy, don't argue, build, which wounds me as a philosophy PhD. I think, just as an aside, like I don't agree with this. I think that you are precisely the people who want to worry about underinvesting in argument and critique. It's really worth taking some time to be explicit and conceptual. But putting that aside, that you're all wrong, I think that there is something to this. What does it mean to have an enduring group of people in a location or scattered across locations? What does it take to empower them to be kind of united by this value set over time, across geographies, across people coming in and out? And I think that, I don't know how many people here have families or want to bring families, or to what extent having schools and having an educational system and having educational values is a bottleneck for you guys. But I think that education can play a critical role in that, and you need to think about education anyway. So what might an education system that really centers around this kind of philosophy look like? Is it like makerspaces 24/7? Is it all project-based learning? Is there a history curriculum or philosophy curriculum that explores these ideas? Is there a history curriculum that's much more focused on progress, on invention, on industriousness, on change, kind of material and technological change throughout time and its significance? I think you can't underestimate this. And what you especially can't underestimate is that if you don't do this in your educational system and you start to bring families into this kind of community and you start to look at it across generations, you will see reversion to the mean. The default, the traditional schooling system with its pseudo-values, which I think of as, basically be smart, be compliant, and, go to college, get a decent upper middle class job by filling out worksheets or the professional equivalent of worksheets. Don't think about it too much. It's out there, and it's entrenched. It's entrenched in things like values are entrenched in things like admission to higher education and the kind of track that it takes to go from K-12 up to a professional career, and breaking free of that. The only thing that will let you break free of that is to conceptualize your alternative values and really be serious about grounding in education in that alternative conception. These are my points. Education is fragmenting. The primary fault lines are about values. And this is an opportunity. It's an opportunity for people who want sociocultural change. It enables a critical layer for experimentation and change that can occur at the level of schooling and education. I'm going to talk more about what I think the right values are and what they look like in schools on Tuesday, but I just wanted to start off by making this meta point that when you think about the future of education, yeah, it's AI, yeah, it's technology, it's the internet, it's decentralized, but more than anything else, it's about parents who are thinking differently about the kinds of person that they want their children to be, and that has to be the most ambitious social experimenters get in front of that issue. That's it. I'll take questions.
All right, everyone, we got about 7 minutes for questions.
Yeah.
So,
do you want this, or?
The question is, how do you measure success in educating values throughout the career of a student, especially in early stage?
So any education system, here's the abstract and unsatisfying answer to that question. Assessment is not a solved problem in education. I don't think that assessment is a solved problem, even in traditional education, like grades and SATs and looking at your projects on resumes. There are things that you can do to approximate assessment of what you want, but there's not a really killer, the problem of assessment is, okay, the student is developing and learning. How do we make more how do we do more than saying, that looks kind of right? I mean, any teacher and any parent will do that. They'll kind of make their own independent judgment, individual judgment of is my child growing in the way that I want them to grow? Are they, what does that look like? And that's not nothing, but how do you do more than that? How do you really measure it, especially if you're, say, running 130 Montessori schools and you're very interested in the values of your students? I think that I have some ideas about things that you can do, but most of my ideas are pretty exploratory. I do think that putting aside values for a second, even though that's what my talk is about, if you're gonna plunge into, we're gonna do education radically differently, which I think everybody should do, a good thing to do is to also take very standard assessments and to think about that. Our kids are gonna take the SATs. I wanna know, how my teenagers are doing with respect to very standard systems that I'm not training them on, not because we're gonna optimize for those systems necessarily, but just because it's important to know, so. That's my non-answer. Yeah.
Hey, I'm Carl Peterson. So I thought your talk was very interesting. I have very strong feelings and opinions about education. For a number of reasons, I'm dyslexic and had not a great time, especially in elementary school. I just had a kid, so I'm very interested now in these sort of things to a degree that I was before, but much more so now. And I broadly agree with your assessment on values. I think the code word that's used to express the values that are implicated now in public education systems in the US is like socialization, right? So you see that when you're talking to someone about like if you have homeschooled kids, how they're going to be socialized, right? So ultimately, though, your assessment of how are we going to use technology to empower like the AI-enabled tutoring of kids? I'm very sympathetic to this, and I like that idea a lot. But I've also seen sort of how things can be or have been executed in terms of online education. So I took my last term of law school at the very beginning of COVID. So I decided to do Zoom school for a quarter. I've seen my wife, who's a college professor, teach some stuff on Zoom before. I've also, taken a number of courses online and had different experiences throughout all of that. And so I think, right, if we are trying to empower kids, I guess with my own value system, it might come out in my question, but if you are trying to empower kids to be as fulfilled as they possibly can be, learning all the things, all the skills they need to learn to be a productive member of society, living a good life, right? This is probably going to end up having different methods of education that come out.
Yeah.
And I'll kind of let you speak to kind of your thoughts beyond that of, yes, I like the idea of like AI-enabled tutors. I'm not confident that is something that can be scaled.
I mean, I think it's just a piece. So I don't think that AI-enabled tutors is the future of education in the sense of this is what's going to fix things. I think it's a major piece. I think it does help. The promise is that it helps scale certain aspects of instructional personalization and instructional design that are very hard to scale. It does not solve for a bunch of other things. And when I think about, I've got two very young children. I've got a 1-year-old and an almost 4-year-old. And I've been thinking about their education since they were 0, before they were born even. And a lot of what I do has to do with how we set up the environment at home. What our routine is as parents when we're doing things around the house or building things or fixing things or working. How do we give ourselves time and space to be patient and let themselves in on that when they're going to be really inefficient at doing it, but they want to help, but it sucks, it's like way slower. How do we think about, if a child is making pancakes, the difference between this child wants to make pancakes right now and this child wants to watch TV and this child wants to play with blocks, like are those all the same? Are those all interests like that kind of inculcate similar values or kind of overlapping values, or like how does that relate to what I want as a parent in terms of the values of my child? And those things are, the way that you scale those things is either by having really good early childhood environments, which is I think what we're working on, kind of like institutional environments like schools, Montessori schools, or by kind of advocating for ideas and services like the ministers in early America did when they said, hey, like moms and dads, you should really read Locke's treatise on education before you educate your child, because it's got really important ideas about like when do you add structure and when do you follow the child's interest, and like those ideas are really critical to the American system of values, and like read it and study it and then like come back and talk to me and get together in a community. Like that's a way of scaling it, but it's very non-tech centric. I don't know if I'm really answering your question, but yeah.
Hello, over here. You talked about how...
Oh, hi, sorry.
You talked about how if you don't have different schools, then your community will regress to the mean and do the usual schools.
Yeah.
And then you won't have a different culture or values. If you do have different schools, though, all your parents and children are still immersed in the rest of the world media. Your kids will go off to college, they'll go off to mix in jobs, etc. Are different schools enough to make and sustain a distinctive culture? Or do you need to be different in other ways too? And how far do you have to go to really make a culture that won't just bleed out and mix in with everything else over the coming decade?
So I don't think that different schools are enough to change culture, to change the world, or to sustain a culture. I think it's one pillar. I also don't think, I've got a 4-year-old at home, almost 4-year-old. If I wanted to say no Disney in the household, I could do it. But I would have to go to war. Like that would not be like, oh, like this is a parent, like we just chose as a parent, like no Disney. That would be like, a sustained campaign over 2 decades. Because she gets it from her peer. Like it would be like, okay, like what do you do when like, your child goes to the playground and every single lunchbox has Elsa on it and you're interested in Elsa. And I also don't think that it's bad. I think that Disney is not terrible. It's mediocre. It's in terms of values. It's high quality in terms of certain things. So what does it take to kind of, so I guess, I mean, the question, if I was going to rephrase your question, when you're thinking about a child and their development, to what extent do you really need to create like a cultural bubble for them? Like really, like you're handcrafting and filtering and really I'm kind of choosing what they get and what they don't get from the world on the basis of what you think is good for them. And to what extent is it like, yeah, like they're gonna live in the world and we're being selective in certain ways, but in other ways, they're gonna interact with the professional system in a fairly normal way. They're gonna interact with the media system in a fairly normal way. I think that you can do a lot in the second category for a child, for an individual child, if you care a lot as a parent. I do think that part of the reason why I think you have to take education so seriously and the curriculum and the scope and sequence and kind of what your values are and what your learning outcomes really are and how those are tracked over time so seriously is because there is constant pressure from elsewhere to regress to the mean, and that threat is always there. But I just kind of totally making a bubble has its own trade-offs. Yeah.
One question. So in regards of Montessori school around or similar ways of having a different way of education, maybe doing it at home with AI support, do you have tips and tricks or ideas how to make a child properly go through the governmental school system? So let's say you don't have a supply of another school form, but you can do something in order to use what you have and let your child get better through it.
So here's very roughly how I think about it, and I'm giving this advice as somebody who has not done this himself. My kids are too young. Hopefully they won't have to do that. But I've thought about this a lot, and I've seen other people go through it. How I would think about it at baseline is you're going to daycare for 5 days a week. Like if you think about it as daycare, and that's the default. And there are reasons why you have to do that given our family situation and given our circumstances, and and there are going to be good things about it and bad things about it. I would assume that they wouldn't. I mean, you have to evaluate your particular teachers in school and what the particular circumstances are. So that's the baseline, and it might be that like there's one really great teacher who your child connects with, and that's great, and you do everything that you can to milk them out of. But assume that it's all pretty mediocre. I think you then have to think about, okay, like in addition to daycare that they're getting 5 days a week, how are we educating them? And that's just a separate question. Like you can separate the question of, I think it's helpful to separate in your mind public schools as this thing that's supposed to give children everything that they need, which they manifestly fail at, and public schools as like a care system that a lot of people use because they need to use it. And once you separate those things in your mind, I think you can actually use schools in a certain way that would be harder to use them otherwise. But it's tricky because the school wants you to treat it as a school. So there's a lot of thinking involved in going down that path. But that's how I would think about it at baseline, is like there's a place that you're gonna go get as much value out of it as you can. In addition, I'm gonna think about your education and how we're gonna foster that at home in the evenings and the mornings, what we're gonna do on the holidays, what we're gonna do on weeks off, to kind of get you the learning and the values that I think are really important as a parent.
Perfect, man. We got one more question.
I would also add, just like we have a progress studies course, so there's actual content.
Yeah, that's true. I mean, there's things like, we've created a lot of homeschooling content for older students, elementary students, middle school students, and high school students, and there's lots of other people in that business too. Sorry, where was the question? Yeah.
One last question, right? Okay, is there any room to have cross-cultural influences? I taught English in Myanmar for about a month, and it took me a few weeks to recognize, I was among other expats there, and a few weeks in, I turned to one of them and I said, I just realized I have not heard one child cry in the past month. And there are babies everywhere, small children.
Yeah.
Or say, mommy, or, this. And I was really curious, and still am to this day, how did the parents do this? And, how can we instill these, what is going on that we can gain best practices, understanding through maybe other cultural means?
Yeah.
I'm assuming it's a cultural difference. I still don't know how they were able to do that.
I'm also very curious,
Yes,
so let me know if you
still
figure it
very
out.
curious.
Yeah.
Now, they are 100% Buddhist
Yeah.
in Myanmar, so that I'm sure that comes through their raising of these children at home, because I don't even think they were in school yet. But it's things like that, things
Yeah.
that you would want to instill in your children, these value systems, which were not, there was no strong arming any of these children.
So here's a kind of point that's adjacent to that, at least. The way that I think about education is it's downstream of parenting. It's 100% downstream of parenting. So this is not how everybody thinks about it. This is not how teachers and schools think about it. But the right way to think about it is, parent has a child. The part of the parent's job is to raise the child right, to give the child the best shot in life, to kind of give the child the right values and skills and tools that they needed. So part of the parent's job is to teach the child and to educate that child. They decide to delegate part of that to a school. So education is a kind of delegation and institutionalization of a certain function that naturally and biologically in a certain way lives with the parent. I think once you see it that way, there are a lot of things about parents. So first, it's just very relevant to this topic of like, what are the parents' value systems? Like, what do they want for the kids? Are people even asking that question? Is there uniformity even amongst this group? Is there agreement in terms of what people want for their children's value systems? Part of why we see fragmentation in education around values is not, there's the pro-values people and the anti-values people. It's like, there's the classical education people, there's the unschooling people, there are very different desires that parents have for their children, and that correlates with different ways that they're raising them, different patterns at home, different patterns of behavior at school, different strengths and weaknesses of the parenting style that might need to be compensated for or not, or kind of like leveraged by the school. I think that's very relevant to schooling. So in terms of, if the question of kind of like cross-cultural parental differences, should that be taken up into education? Yes, absolutely. Like schools should be, there's tremendous alpha in schools being interested in what the parents want and what the parents are doing. Almost no schools are. Even the private schools that you pay $80,000 a year for and they send you progress reports individualized, they don't really do this. They don't really get into, what do you want? How can we really partner with you? How can we help you? The school that does that, I mean, that is a way of saying the school of the future is the school that does that, because that's where the kind of values intersection and uptake lies. Thank you.